We now bring to these microphones David James. It's that time, check your clock, for the weekly conversation between David and myself. We know that all of our listeners this week witnessed the worst mass shooting in United States history. And in light of this, we've decided to deal with a topic that I don't believe we've ever covered before, and that is the problem of evil and suffering in this world. David, your thoughts?
Well, that's right. Of course, it has been a heart-wrenching week as we've watched the videos, we've listened to the news reports, we've watched this unfold, and actually I've been praying this week for families of the victims as well as leaders there in the community and people who are still recovering. I think it should be a matter of prayer, and we can talk about that a little bit later. This is the first time we dealt with this, although there have been other tragedies and certainly been times that we could have dealt with it in the past.
David, you know this massacre in Las Vegas hasn't been the only tragedy to hit Americans in the past couple of weeks. There were also 3 recent hurricanes, with yet another one about to hit possibly the Gulf Coast pretty soon now. And these have led some to say that these and other natural disasters are judgments against an America that has turned its back on God. What do you think?
Well, certainly God can use nature as well as people and nations to bring judgment against different groups of people. But my one concern about this particular thing, or a couple of concerns I have, is one, America does not stand as a people of God in the same way that Israel does. There are questions as to whether America was ever truly a Christian nation. What actually would define a nation being Christian? Is it 100% of the population, 80%, etc.? Of course, we were founded upon some biblical principles by the original founders, but even not all of them were true believers. But beyond that, I think it's very dangerous for us to try to discern the mind of God on this. Apart from special revelation, which God has given us in the Bible, where He used these things to judge, and will also do so in the future, to assign God's motives to and actions to specific events, I think is going out into the realm of speculation and goes beyond what we're allowed to do or commanded to do in the Word of God. So although it could be that, I think we should not be speculating on whether any particular event is connected with a particular decision or action of God.
So then, David, whether we're talking about natural disasters or terrible diseases or the horrible suffering caused by wars, terrorists, and even genocidal maniacs, untold millions who have suffered and died through the centuries would have the same question. We sometimes hear the question, could not God have created a world without evil and without suffering?
Well, the fact is, He did do just that. When He created, we read in Genesis, in the creation account, after the 6 days of creation, God looked at all that He had created, and it was very good. That was God's judgment and His assessment of what He had just done, and therefore, evil and suffering could not have been a part of the original creation. Now, there's a difference between God being the author of evil and making the possibility for evil to exist, and He did that through the creation of free will. He did not create either the angels or men to be automatons or robots or puppets on His strings, but rather He made angels and men free moral agents. And of course we read in Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14 about the fall of Satan, and Satan was the highest cherub that God had created, the highest of angels, perhaps the most beautiful, perhaps the most powerful. And we understand that as a free moral agent that pride welled up in his heart, and he decided that he would set himself above the Most High God. And then in Genesis 3, this fallen cherub, Satan, tempted Eve in the garden, and this was passed on to Adam, and they sinned against God. So in that way, sin entered the universe, and sin entered into the human reality as mankind fell. So God did create a world without evil and suffering, but He did not. That does not mean that He had to create it without the capacity for free moral agents to choose to rebel.
David, atheists often try to argue against the existence of the God of the Bible by saying either God is not all good or he is not all-powerful, because an all-good, all-powerful God would not allow these kinds of things to happen?
Well, I think, one, it represents a misunderstanding on the part of an atheist who isn't a believer and therefore who is not indwelt by the Spirit of God to understand the deep things of the Spirit of God, as we read in 1 Corinthians 2:14. But also, I would say this, they don't realize that they're actually talking about a two-edged sword here. Because if God could prevent the kinds of tragedies that we've seen this past week, that means that he could also and should also prevent all other kinds of sin as well. So that would mean that if an atheist, for example, chooses to commit adultery and cheat on his wife, then God should intervene and prevent him from committing that sin. If someone who decides to lie or cheat or steal, those are sins, and we also know that all these sins, the worst of the sins, have their root in the heart. And so Jesus said, for example, that if someone looks on a woman and lusts in his heart, that he's the same as committing adultery. Or someone who is angry against his brother without a cause, he is also guilty of murder. So also, we would say that atheists are guilty of all these kinds of sins, and therefore they should not be allowed to exercise their free will. God should stop them from doing those things as well. So it's really a hollow argument that and it's a two-edged sword that cuts both ways, and even atheists would not want to be subjected to a God who would intervene in such a way. So it's not a good argument against the existence of God at all.
In the Bible, there seems to be three sources of suffering: nature, man, and fallen angels. That would include Satan, by the way, as well. Let's first discuss nature. What does the Bible have to say about nature and human suffering?
Well, in Romans chapter 8, beginning in verse 19, Paul wrote this, "For the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly awaits for the revealing of the sons of God." In other words, the full redemption of both mankind and then ultimately the creation itself. And he says, "For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope, because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God." And he goes on to say, "We know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now." Now, we can trace this back to actually Genesis chapter 3 and the fall of man. It was not only man that fell, but God brought the whole creation under judgment. For example, in Genesis 3:17, God says to Adam, "Cursed is the ground for your sake, and toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life." So something happened throughout the whole creation to bring corruption and decay and death into the whole creation, and not just to man. Furthermore, when we read about the flood account from Genesis 6 through chapter 9, we read that in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened." And so what happened was the entire climate of the world changed, the geographic nature of the world changed, the geology of the world changed, and so the conditions that we find on earth now, which are very dangerous, are ultimately an outgrowth of, one, the fall of the creation in Genesis chapter 3, but then the results of God's judgment upon the earth against sin, and the world we live in today is still reeling from that judgment that God exercised upon the world.
Oh, then there is the suffering caused by the evil of human beings, which seems to argue against the popular view that most people are inherently good.
Well, that's right. The Bible makes it very clear that people are not inherently good. Again, going back to the fall of man, it was not just Adam and Eve who fell, it was Adam and all his descendants, and so we inherit a sin nature. Jeremiah in chapter 17, verse 9, a very well-known verse from the Old Testament, says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it?" And then in Romans chapter 3, Paul, quoting from the Psalms and other places, says this, "There is none righteous, no, not one. There is none who understands God. There is none who seeks after God. They have all turned aside. They have become together unprofitable. He said, their mouths have practiced deceit. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. This is exactly what we saw in Las Vegas this week and in other tragedies around the world, terrorist actions and all of this. So man is not inherently good. He is sinful.
David, what about the suffering caused by Satan and demons? How are we to deal with that?
Well, even though there are those who would say that you have to confront Satan directly or confront demons directly, I would say that those things were reserved for Jesus himself and his apostles who he commissioned to do that. But for the believer today, we find instruction in James chapter 4 where James says that God resists the proud and gives grace to the humble. Therefore, submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. And then, of course, in Ephesians chapter 6, we read about putting on the full armor of God. So we take a defensive stance. We submit ourselves to God. We entrust God to protect us from Satan as we simply hold our ground and don't give pride a place in our lives. And James says that Satan will flee from us in those situations.
Finally, David, how should we respond in our hearts and in our minds, and what should we do in the face of evil and suffering that's all around us?
Well, first of all, I would say this. Life is short, hell is hot, and eternity is a long time. So we know that our lives are but a vapor, and so we need to understand the gospel. We need to hear, understand, and believe the gospel of Jesus Christ, and that is Jesus Christ, the Son of God, God himself, came to earth, died on a cross for us in our place, taking the punishment that we deserve, and rose again on the third day. And by trusting in him for our salvation, we will receive both forgiven sin and eternal life. Another thing is, I would say we shouldn't be anxious or fearful. Understand that we have a loving God who is in control and works all things together for the good of those who love God. And then I would say we need to pray for those involved, the families affected, law enforcement and other first responders, healthcare workers, and also government leaders as they deal with these situations. And then especially, I would say in some ways, for the pastors and churches in these areas to meet the physical, spiritual, and emotional needs of these people. And then I would finally say, if you're able, that you can donate time and resources to help those in need through reputable organizations and churches. That is another way that we can be involved with this.
Great word, David. Great word. And it's a discussion that I just felt we had to have, and I'm glad you suggested we take this direction in our conversation this week. David, thank you so much. We'll have another conversation next week.
Thanks so much, Jimmy. Great to be with you.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, I'm going to take a look at the book. It's all ahead right here on Prophecy Today.